It was Halloween night in 2008, and a 24-year-old woman named Arpana was attending a Halloween party in her own apartment complex. That Friday night was a lively scene, with many of her neighbours, including Arpana herself, opening up their apartments for the festivities. The following Monday, Arpana's body would be discovered inside her apartment, the victim of an apparent homicide. More than a decade later, no one has been held accountable for her murder. Arpana grew up in Hyderabad, India, and showed an interest for art, writing and gymnastics from a very young age. But in her teenage years, she became a bit of a tech prodigy and participated in a hardware design contest that seemed to cement her down the path of computing. By age 21, Arpana had become incredibly skilled in embedded systems and gained international notoriety in 2005 when she took part in a design contest for Microchip. In June 2005, Arpana was featured in the New Indian Express, in which she spoke about her love of working with computers and using them to innovate new and exciting things. After attending a prestigious university in India, Arpana went to obtain her master's degree from a university in America, Rutgers University. After getting her master's degree, she decided to stay in the US and accepted a job as a software quality assurance engineer with the tech giant EMC. She would begin working there in March of 2008, and the company spokesman would later say that during her brief 6-month tenure at the company, she had cemented herself as a hardworking and bright employee who was considered a rising star among her peers. By October that year, she'd already been promoted to lead programmer, so clearly just a very driven and intelligent young woman. During this time, Arpana moved to Redmond, Washington, where she built a supportive social circle around her. She then purchased a Suzuki motorcycle and began learning how to safely ride it. She even joined a local motorcycle club, the Pacific Northwest Riders, and went on long rides throughout Washington that summer. Arpana also volunteered at the Redmond Fire Department, riding along to fires in the area, as well as animal shelters where she helped care for unwanted pets. So just an incredibly amazing human being. On Halloween of 2008, Arpana showed up for work as usual and told co-workers about a party that was happening at her apartment complex that night. After work, she picked up some Halloween decorations and begun decorating her apartment. Later that night, Arpana and her neighbours would open up their apartments for the party, which would move throughout the complex over several hours. More than 24 people would attend that evening, but most of the guests left Arpana's apartment for her neighbours just after 9 p.m. So I guess Arpana's apartment was the pre-drinking area to the party, or the early part of the party, if you will. At some point, Arpana reportedly had an argument with a man about race, which likely resulted from comments he had made. Despite this, she moved on quickly and seemed to enjoy the rest of the party, because she just doesn't sound like the type that would hold a grudge. It was around 3 a.m. when the festivities began to die down, and Arpana was last seen by numerous people leaving an apartment on the first floor and was heading back up to her apartment on the third floor to get some sleep. Over the next hour, neighbours on both sides would report hearing what sounded like sex taking place, which they were certain was coming from Arpana's apartment. One neighbour later remarked that at around 8 a.m. he was awoken by a horrible growling, which persisted for about 20 seconds and was accompanied by a solid thud. He then heard the sound of running water from her apartment for about an hour, but didn't give these sounds a second thought. Investigators would later speculate that this was the time Arpana's life was coming to an end and the killer was trying to cover up his tracks. When Arpana failed to show up to work that next Monday, one of her co-workers would attempt to call her but couldn't get through to her phone. At the same time, her family was desperately trying to call her, having not heard from her since the night before the party, so Thursday night. This was unusual for Arpana, as she talked to them often over the phone. Eventually, they reached out to a family friend named Jay, who was a professor in the States, and asked him to check in on her at her apartment. Jay arrived at the apartment and was met by one of her neighbours, CJ, who happened to be nearby. They knocked on the apartment door, and to their surprise, the door swung right open. It quickly became evident that the door had been forced open and the jamb was broken. The two of them were met with an apartment in disarray, and after briefly scanning the place, they located Arpana lying on her bedroom floor, already in the process of decomposing. After making this gruesome discovery, Jay called 911. Over the next few hours, police began arriving at the scene and gathered statements. Crime scene investigators with the Washington State Patrol would arrive at the scene roughly 4 hours after the 911 call was made. According to police spokesman early on, what the investigators were finding was indicative of homicide, but they would remain tight-lipped in the days to come. Arpana's body was taken to the King County Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy. A few days later, a ceremony was held in Redmond, and her body was then flown back to India to be buried. Members of the Pacific Northwest Riders organised memorial rides in her honour too. For Arpana's parents, they not only had to grieve the loss of their oldest daughter, but an inspiring and bright young soul who'd accomplished so much in so little time and obviously had so much more to give. The scene at Arpana's apartment indicated that the murderer had specifically targeted her and had violently assaulted and raped her. The killer had kicked in the front door, which had been locked and deadbolted beforehand, which just... it's horrible, the fact that she did everything right. The struggle likely began in the main parts of the apartment before concluding in Arpana's bedroom, where she was found. Her nude and bloody body was face down beside her bed, and she'd been posthumously covered in numerous liquids, including bleach and motor oil. When officers and investigators had arrived at Arpana's apartment, they made notes of the smell of chemical agents. Someone had attempted to scrub the apartment of their presence, wiping bleach onto several pieces of furniture. In the dumpster, investigators found a bottle of motorcycle oil, which the offender had likely found inside the apartment and then sprayed all over the crime scene and Arpana's body. The empty bottle was found inside a plastic bag, also containing Arpana's Halloween costume, a blood-stained bathrobe, and sheets from Arpana's bed, which were missing from the crime scene. In the bathroom, a white bed comforter was found, also stained with blood, and was soaking in the tub in a mixture of water and bleach. Several items found in the apartment had also been burned by the killer, including a green blanket that belonged to Arpana, pieces of her Halloween costume, a black sheet, and portions of carpet. It would later be found that certain items were missing from the scene, including an ID card, her BlackBerry, and her digital camera, none of which were ever recovered. The disappearance of the phone and the camera pointed towards someone who knew Arpana, as nothing else of value had been stolen. It suggested that the killer may have been on the phone or the camera and wanted to get rid of the evidence. The autopsy revealed that Arpana had been strangled to death, likely by a bootlace, at least 2 days before her body was found, and this correlates to the hours after the party. She had suffered blunt force blows to the head, the breaking of several teeth, had been gagged by her own underwear, which the assailant had used duct tape to keep in place, and was then raped. In the months to come, several suspects and persons of interest would be investigated, but there wasn't enough evidence to move forward with them. Investigators were also struggling to find a motive behind the murder. It wasn't until 2 years later when King County officials announced the arrest of a 27-year-old Emmanuel de Melvin Fair at a press conference. Fair was no stranger to law enforcement, having been arrested nearly a dozen times and serving sentences for multiple crimes, which included drug and firearm-related crimes and sexual offences. After his most recent arrest, Fair was released early, being labelled a Level 1 offender, so the ones that were least likely to reoffend. Fair would begin floating between prison and homelessness at the time of the murder, and was couch surfing with a friend called Leslie at Arpana's apartment complex. Fair had at least one brief encounter with Arpana at the party and spent time with Arpana's neighbour CJ, who would co-discover her body with Jay. In the weeks after Arpana's murder, Fair was questioned and admitted to being inside Arpana's apartment and claimed that he met her briefly that night. King County prosecutors then announced that they were filing charges against Fair for the murder. According to the prosecutors, DNA from Fair had been recovered on several pieces of evidence that they believed the killer had touched. This included the tape used to gag Arpana, DNA recovered from her neck, and the bloody robe found in the dumpster. There were also inconsistencies in Fair's story. Even though he claimed to have retired to his friend Leslie's apartment at around 1 a.m. to sleep, cell phone records indicated that he made dozens of calls to numerous women between 2 and 5 a.m., including several calls to Leslie herself. Prosecutors were pursuing a life sentence due to the sheer brutality of the crime, but Fair entered a plea of not guilty. Fair's attorneys claimed that investigators had seemed particularly hostile towards Fair and had not extended that hostility towards other white suspects, who may have had more of a motive to kill Arpana. Due to a debate about a new type of DNA and genotyping, Fair would be awaiting trial for quite some time. The trial would begin in February 2017, more than 6 years after he'd been charged and over 8 years after the murder. Imagine just sitting and waiting for 6 years in a prison cell for a trial because of some debate of genotyping. I don't understand it. This is someone's life we're talking about. The analysis of the evidence had been performed by True Allele, making it the first criminal trial in Washington state that this was done. It had been used in other states as well as acquittals in Washington, but never in this particular manner. It was found that DNA from several men was evident at the crime scene, including several of Arpana's neighbours and fellow partygoers, which makes sense because there were a lot of people there that night. Though some of these individuals had not even attended the Halloween party, which made the discovery much more surprising. But in my eyes, that might just be that they visited, quite recently beforehand, or I don't know, like they lived there beforehand. I don't know how long DNA lasts, but there is that chance. The semen from an unnamed neighbour was also found on a towel near Arpana's body, which, yeah. The defence pointed out that Fair had a small accident at the party, which resulted in him getting a bloody lip in the apartment. As a result, this likely causes DNA to be distributed throughout the apartment, particularly in the bathroom where he cleaned himself up. 2 months after the trial began, it would end with a hung jury, and before a retrial was set to begin, it was placed on hold pending a discretionary review by the Court of Appeals. CJ, the neighbour, lived right next door to Arpana, and they knew each other very, very well. The two hung out often after Arpana moved to Redmond, but the relationship began to drift apart in the weeks before the murder, due to Arpana volunteering and being at the motorcycle club. In his interviews, CJ admitted that during this time, he'd stopped taking his psychiatric medication. Investigators would never ask him what this medication was or what mental illness it was treating. You'd think that would be at the top of the list if someone just volunteered that evidence. CJ showed up to the Halloween party rather late and was already heavily intoxicated on his arrival. He later told investigators that he was sexually attracted to Arpana and was hoping to hook up with her later that evening. While CJ says that he went back to his apartment at around midnight, his phone records show that he called Arpana twice a few hours later, once at 2:56 and another at 3:02 a.m. These were indeed the last calls or texts that Arpana would receive that night, and when questioned about them, CJ claimed not to remember anything about them. But when police revealed that they had obtained a log of his text messages and calls directly from his cell provider, he audibly responded, "Oh crap." Multiple witnesses had claimed to see Arpana returning to her apartment at around 3 a.m. and then recalled hearing moaning. CJ was one of those neighbours and claimed to have passed out on a couch against his and Arpana's shared wall, and said that he was woken up shortly after 3 a.m. to the sound of moaning before falling back to sleep until 10 a.m. A witness who was returning home from work at 3 a.m. later told police that they saw a non-black individual standing in Arpana's doorway. The description closely resembled CJ rather than any other suspect, including Fair. When asked whether or not he'd gone next door to Arpana's apartment before making his 2 phone calls, CJ told investigators, "I don't think so." The morning after the Halloween party, CJ drove to the Canadian border, attempting to not stop or declare himself. Border officials did stop him, thankfully, searched his vehicle and turned him away because he didn't have a passport on him. When asked about this trip, CJ would later tell police he was kind of wanting to explore and offered up no further explanation. Later that day, CJ attended a party at a friend's house in Everett and attempted to wrestle them. Those at the party remember him arriving with a noticeable limp, and when investigators asked about this later, he said it had come from a wrestling match at the party. Other witnesses that knew CJ claimed that over the next several days and weeks, he made vague statements alluding to him going over to Arpana's apartment in his sleep. Some were also concerned about his emotional state at the time due to his past relationship with Arpana and his seeming to have become resentful towards her because of her newer relationships. At points, CJ even asked people whether or not he had killed Arpana, seeming to be unaware of the answer himself. Over the next 2 years, CJ was interviewed multiple times and was unable to remember certain details. He didn't have an alibi for what he was doing at the time of the murder, and he couldn't recall whether or not he'd kicked in Arpana's front door. How can you not recall if you've kicked in someone's front door? If you can't recall that, then you did it, right? CJ's DNA had also been found on the bottle of motor oil and on the bloody robe too, so it's just not looking good for him. All of this evidence made it virtually impossible for prosecutors to rule out CJ as a suspect, obviously, which is why they ultimately presented a case that didn't do so. In fact, they posited throughout the first trial that he may have been an accomplice, but he was ultimately never charged for having any involvement in the murder. Fair's second trial began in 2019, and although CJ was called to the stand during this one, he was limited in what he could be asked due to his privilege against self-incrimination. The jury reached a consensus of not guilty, and I'm not surprised. After 9 years of awaiting his fate, 35-year-old Emmanuel Fair was released from custody hours after being acquitted in the death of Arpana Jinaga. In the year since the second trial ended, the story received close to no attention from the wider world, and Arpana Jinaga's murder remains unsolved. Interestingly though, there were a couple of high-profile criminals in the area at the time who could have committed the murder. Mark Patrick O'Leary, an army veteran, is a convicted rapist and home invader. While O'Leary was arrested for crimes he committed in Colorado, he committed earlier crimes in Washington, including in the area where Arpana lived, where he also lived. While O'Leary never killed any of his known victims, an encrypted file on his hard drive was found, which has been nicknamed the Wretch by investigators. The file contains incriminating details about O'Leary that he's refused to share. Another military veteran who's become a suspect is Israel Keyes. Keyes was a methodical serial killer who obsessively planned out his crimes, but was also known to act on impulse. Keyes later committed suicide in jail while awaiting trial, but police believe he may have committed as many as 11 murders. Not only was Keyes accustomed to Washington, having grown up there and serving at Fort Lewis in the early 2000s, he travelled to Seattle on the weekend of Arpana's murder and remained in Seattle until the 2nd of November. Arpana was 24 years old when she was killed on the 1st of November 2008. She was a woman who contributed so much to help better the world around her, but instead of being able to continue along this path, her life was brought to a violent and sudden end on the morning after a Halloween party. And the worst part of this is that no one still has been held accountable. I really hope you enjoyed this case today. If you have any thoughts about it, obviously please pop them in the comments, and if you have any suggestions of cases that you'd like me to make videos on, please let me know. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next one.